Every day, not only Shabbos and Yom Tov, should be a holy day. How do we know that? Let's see. In Pasuk in this week's parasha that tells us Savas b'nei Yisov Amata Lehem, instruct the Jewish people and tell them as karbonai lachmi le'yisharach nichoichi tishmeru laki b'moyadoi, that you should bring these karbonos which Hashem considers like His, so to speak, food. You should bring them at the correct time. Stoltzach Rashi v'vot b'moyadoi. So Rashi takes that word b'moyadoi, bring it at its time, and it's meforish, and he explains that b'chol yom hu moedat midim, that every single day is the designated time for the Tamid daily offering. Down from Fashem, we have to understand what's he telling us that we don't already know. What is Rashi innovating that we don't see in the very next pasuk? Because Dorten State there it says that you have to bring 2 animals daily as an oila, meaning as the akrovas atmidim is tamid b'chol yom. That tells you that to bring the carbon tamid is something you have to do on a daily basis. So the pasuk in the Meshen pasuk if involved b'moyadoi. So if the pasuk is going to tell us that you have to bring it every single day, why does Rashi have to explain one pasuk earlier that the tamid means the correct time for the tamid is every single day? So we're going to see 2 possible explanations. One from a commentary on Rashi the Re'im, and one from one of the other commentators, the Ibn Ezra. The Re'im lent as Rashi kommt nicht sagen as das mitzvah neges b'chol yom. The Re'im says, Rashi, when he says b'moyadoi means that every single day is the day designated for the tamid, that's not to tell us that every single day you bring the tamid, because exactly it's going to be stated in the next pasuk. From das steht doch meferish in pasuk kanal, right? It's going to be in the next pasuk. Nahachi pirusha, rather the Re'im says what he means is as jeden tag zman atmidim, that every single day is the appropriate time to bring the carbon tamid, and therefore ve'ein shum maneh bahem. There's nothing that could prevent you from bringing the carbon tamid. Even if there's a state of tumah, you still bring the carbon tamid on its correct day. Great concept, halachically accurate, but Rashi is the but to try to fit that into what Rashi is saying needs a lot of insight, because Rashi had Geshem Pirushai Ichfar ben Chamish Lemikra. As we know, Rashi's target audience also included the 5-year-old. Hani b'loshen berura Ichfarem. In other words, Rashi speaks in a language that is clear, even for a child to understand. In other words, and Rashi volt gemein sagen has mismachrit tmidim alamal afilu betuma. If Rashi's intention was that we should know that to bring the carbon tamid at all times, even in a state of impurity, what it does gesagt, beferish he would have said so. Because we know that the word b'moyadoi in Parshas Ba'aloischa is used in reference to Pesach, and there Rashi tells us that after Shabbos, after Tumah, that you bring the carbon Pesach even if it's Shabbos, and even if the entire community is Tameh. So Rashi should have done the same thing here, if that's what he intended. And by the way, on that subject, we need to really understand, if in Parshas Ba'aloischa Rashi translated the word b'moyadoi to mean that it supersedes Shabbos and impurity, why didn't he give the same translation over here? I was going to get a Shabbos taf and dober for Rashi nitkin limud. So you'll say, well, in this particular context, Rashi didn't have to discuss Shabbos because the pasuk does. So the Torah tells us clearly that you bring the special karbanos of Shabbos over and above the tamid. So there the Torah told us clearly that you bring the tamid on Shabbos. Rashi doesn't have to explain it. But if you bring the carbon tamid in a state of impurity, we need to know that somehow. Rashi should have told us how that happens. So the Re'im's explanation that Rashi is telling us over here, but moyadoi means even in a state of tumah, does not seem to be what Rashi is saying, even though it's accurate information. So let's see what the Ibn Ezra says, and then we're going to ask why Rashi doesn't say a similar thing. The Ibn Ezra taich b'moyadoi sheli kadmo koidem ha'boiker v'sheli acher ha'erev. So the Ibn Ezra says, b'moyadoi means that you have to bring the carbon tamid in the morning, but you can't bring it earlier than when it's considered morning, and you have to bring it in the afternoon, and you cannot bring it later than what is considered afternoon. Or if he says, moving favos dav shem b'moyadoi, that's why the Torah has to say b'moyadoi, bring it in the correct time span. Even though it tells us that you bring it daily, and even if it told us what time of day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, because the Torah in b'moyadoi, as Ibn Ezra says, is being even more specific. You can't bring it too early, nor can you bring it too late. In that case, we need to understand why doesn't Rashi say b'moyadoi like the Ibn Ezra does, that this is telling us the time span within which the carbon tamid has to be brought. Was like them is moving that explains the word b'moyadoi, and it works with pshat, which is Rashi's approach. Why didn't he do it? So to understand that, let's first examine how and why Rashi addressed the words b'moyadoi in v'haloischa versus over here. The chilek zwischen Pirashas and Parshas and Pirashas and Parshas Ba'aloischa is, so the distinction is as follows. In Parshas Ba'aloischa, what motivated Rashi to comment was in the context of Ba'aloischa, the word b'moyadoi, to bring it in the correct time, seems to be unnecessary language. Why is it unnecessary? The pasuk is because the pasuk is immediately going to tell us the exact time when you bring the Korban Pesach. On the 14th of the month, in the afternoon. So all the information that we have is already given. So why do you have to give the word b'moyadoi? Therefore, Rashi says that b'moyadoi must be telling us even more than just the date and time of the Korban Pesach. What is it? B'moyadaf v'Shabbos, b'moyadaf b'tumah, to teach us that that time is to be honored even if it's Shabbos and even if everybody's impure. In our case, Rashi is not looking at b'moyadoi as an extra word in the pasuk. Rashi is saying the normal translation of b'moyadoi doesn't work in this pasuk. The Pashta Taich from B'moyadoi is in dem Zman was der Ruf Vashtim Kivorn. The direct translation of B'moyadoi is do it in the time allocated for it. Like for example in Parshas Vayera, when the Malachim say they're going to come back L'moyed, it means the time that I'm going to assign for you. That's usually what B'moyadoi means. Time that will be assigned for a particular purpose. So then it makes sense when you're talking about the carbon that has to be brought on Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, or Yom Tov, which are special days. Karbonos was coming with man is moving the Lashon b'moyadoi. Then you can understand why you'd say bring those karbonos in the allocated times, because there are special times on the calendar allocated. Shabbos is allocated for a carbon, Rosh Chodesh is etc. Yeah, the carbon is makrif in dem kavod dikin tug. So that makes sense. There's a special day, and you have to bring the carbon on that special day. But the carbon tamid, there's no special day allocated for the carbon tamid. It has to be brought every single day, 365 days of the year. That's what the name means. Carbon tamid. That's why it's called the carbon tamid. Oila tamid. So if it's a daily occurrence, it doesn't really fit with the concept of moyadoi, which is an allocated time. There's no special time allocated for the Talmud. That's what's bothering Rashi. On the far landed Rashi with the Pirush Even Ezra. Therefore, Rashi cannot go with the explanation that Even Ezra offered, which was that it's telling us not to bring the carbon too early or too late, because that doesn't address the point. But moyadoi means an allocated date. There is no allocated date for the carbon Talmud. Because the Even Ezra's explanation is not explaining which day is allocated for the carbon tamid, but rather what time of the day is for the carbon tamid, which is not the meaning of the word b'moyadoi. All the Even Ezra is saying, be really careful that you pay attention to the clock and you don't bring the carbon too early or too late. Rashi says that does not suit the meaning of the word b'moyadoi, an allocated time, a designated date. In fact, the Even Ezra's explanation is not something about the specific unique time of the Korban Tamid. It's about a specific law within the Korban Tamid, and actually that law applies to other Korbanos too, that they have to be brought within the time range that is dedicated to that Korban. Besides, the simple understanding of the pasuk really would not flow nicely with the Even Ezra's explanation. Because the logic should have been, first tell me generally what day is the carbon tamid supposed to be brought, which is daily. Then tell me what time of day, morning and evening. And then tell me, and don't bring it too early or too late. That would be a logical flow. First, you tell me that they have to be brought twice a day, and then then you tell me what time of day, one sheep in the morning, one in the afternoon. Because the Even Ezra is saying the word b'moyadoi isn't addressing the overall time for this carbon, but the specific law around something that you've already told me about the carbon. So the logical flow should have been, tell me what day it is, every day. Tell me what time of day, morning and evening. Then put in the proviso, not too early, not too late. That's not what the Even Ezra is That's not what the pasuk is saying, and so that's not really pshat. Wouldn't work for Rashi. The fact that the Torah first gives us the word b'moyadai and then tells us when that is, shnayim layoim. And especially considering that it tells us b'moyadai before telling us what time of day that you're supposed to bring the korban tamid, in the morning and afternoon, is must mean that the word b'moyadai is, as it usually is, describing the time frame, the allocated date for this particular korban. And Rashi says, well, what is the allocated date for this korban? Therefore, Rashi has to tell us that the Torah wants us to know that every single day is the appropriate allocated time for a korban tamid. As the pasuk tamid, which means that the Torah is actually giving us a new definition of the korban tamid. Because b'parshas Lendman, as korban tamid is need gleich sal korbanos hamoyadim. Logic says that the korban tamid is completely different to a korban that is aligned or associated with a special day on the calendar. The other korbanos hamusaf has a special time where it belongs; it doesn't belong any other time. Whereas the tamid doesn't have a specific time of the year or time of the month where it belongs. You bring it every single day. That's why it's called the daily oila. So you'd think that the tamid is in a different category to the others. Those are special time-oriented korbanos. This is just a daily korban. Therefore, Zokt Rashi as mikb'moyad, the pasuk zogin, that the Torah is actually giving us new information because it chooses the word b'moyad as an introduction to the korban tamid. It's illustrating as a Pinchas nitazoi that distinction we want to make between the musaf of Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, and Yom Tov versus the tamid is an inaccurate distinction. Every single day of the calendar is a special allocated time for the korban tamid, just like Shabbos is an allocated time for the musaf of Shabbos. Rashi is identifying that every single day of the calendar is a unique allocated time for a korban tamid. Like Shabbos is for a musaf, every day is for a tamid. Now, what's the practical difference? What practical difference will it mean? We're still going to bring the korban every single day. So what's the difference if I know that every day is associated with the korban tamid or allocated to the korban tamid versus if I'm just bringing the korban tamid daily? Is those moving bepashtus? Well, actually, it's a pretty clear distinction. Because weiter in der Parsha, Benegedon coming from Shabbos, it's going to have a very practical application, which we'll see in the case of Shabbos. That's the very next issue that's addressed in this Parsha. There, Rashi quotes the pasuk that says you have to bring the oila of a Shabbos on its Shabbos. On its Shabbos means you can't bring the oila that was supposed to be this Shabbos, you can't bring it next Shabbos. Meaning, if a person didn't bring the musaf for Shabbos today, I would have thought that maybe next week I should bring 2 karbanos musaf to catch up for this Shabbos. Therefore, the Torah says, no, the musaf of Shabbos belongs on its Shabbos. Magid to teach us that if you miss the day, the korban is no longer relevant. Now, V is the dim tamid. So, okay, that's Shabbos. It's very clear. What about a korban tamid? If for whatever reason they did not bring the korban tamid today, should they bring 2 tomorrow, or is it the same principle? When the day has passed, the korban is no longer a korban. So the easiest way to say, well, would be Shabbos is the binyan of. You look at the Shabbos, and we're told that if Shabbos passes, that korban is now worthless, and the same applies to any time-based korban, which is basically any korban. And you could say, because that's why Rashi says, if the day has passed, not if the Shabbos has passed, to extrapolate out to other korbanos, that if the day designated for that korban has passed, you've lost your chance. And we could just then say that that's the rule across the board for all korbanos. Miss the day, miss the opportunity. However, that's not the case. It's not so simple. Because just a few psukim later, when it says you bring the musaf of Rosh Chodesh on the day of Rosh Chodesh, Rashi again says, if the day passes, you lose the opportunity to bring the musaf for Rosh Chodesh. There is no way to catch up. The funis moving as the limit von Shabbos b'Shabbatoi is nicht benegay korban. If I have to explain the rule that you missed the day, you missed the korban again by Rosh Chodesh, that means I did not learn it from Shabbos. That means when we were told if you miss the musaf of Shabbos, it's worthless. That is not automatically a general rule for all korbanos. Nochmer. The truth is, even the musafim that have to be brought on Yom Tov, we also learn specifically from a pasuk in Parshas Emer of Dvar Yom B'Yom, back in Parshas Emer where it says each korban on its day, Tachashi. There Rashi also says if the day has passed, you've lost the korban. So now, the fact that the Torah specifies this in the case of Shabbos, in the case of Rosh Chodesh, and in the case of Yom Tov, sounds like it's not a generic rule, it's only in those cases. But Pizeh kommt lecherois, which would seem to imply, as it would seem as if you miss the day of the korban tamid, you haven't lost your opportunity, and perhaps you do have to bring it again. As their din is by korban tamid, until you get Rashi's insight, b'moyadoi, which maybe that implies that if you miss the day, b'moyado, you didn't bring it on the day allocated for it, you cannot bring the korban tamid tomorrow. But bald, as I get from korban tamid, is kanal nicht blois, as man darf ständig bechol yom makriv sein a korban, because Rashi is pointing out that the definition of a korban tamid is not just simply that you have to bring the korban daily, nor bechol yom moye dat midim, but rather that every calendar day is the appropriate allocated time for the korban tamid. Yeah, the tag is abazunder moed, every single day is its own special day. This is the day allocated for this particular korban. It's been made a movement as well, then the logic says, if today, which was allocated for this particular korban tamid, passed, and I did not bring this korban tamid, I've lost the opportunity. Same as if it was a Shabbos or if it was a Yom Tov. Deswegen darf man nicht haben auf dem Limit meyuchad, also ich bei Tom is the din as over Yom Chulei, and yet, even though that is the halacha, you don't have to have the Torah telling it to us, like it said, Shabbos b'Shabbato, or Chodesh b'Chodshoi. Why not? Afal Shabbos regolim seinen doch sicher ausgetelte Tag, was mis makre beim korban. Afal kein darfen bei je haben apostel mit meyuchad as im over Yom korban, and that's quite surprising, because Shabbos we know is a special day, and yet the Torah had to tell me specifically that if you miss Shabbos, you can't bring the korban next Shabbos. And yet, the Tamid, which doesn't seem to be a special day, you don't have to tell me that if I miss it, I can't bring it tomorrow. The reason is because there's a fundamental difference between the nature of korbanos brought on special days, Rosh Chodesh, Shabbos, Yom Tov, versus the nature of the tamid brought every single day. What's the difference? The Oizgetelkeit legabe Shayimais Hashanah from Shabbos and Regolim is neat mitzad akravas hakorbanos shabahem, because what distinguishes Shabbos or Yom Tov or Rosh Chodesh from ordinary days is not the korban. No mitzad atzmam. The day is distinct. Shabbos hayom kodesh and is also b'mlacha. Shabbos is a holy day, unlike Monday or Wednesday. It's a day you're not allowed to work, unlike a Thursday. Yom Tov, and the same with Yom Tov. Yom Tov is unique. It's not like a regular day because you're not allowed to work, and it has certain mitzvahs that you don't do the rest of the year. You don't have to eat matzah, shake a lulav, listen to shofar. Now in detail, so there's a special day called Shabbos, and it has its own rules that distinguish it from the rest of the week. And you have to bring a korban on Shabbos. But the korban doesn't make Shabbos into a special day. And the fact that it's a special day is not only about the korban. Und der Fall ist Lule, dem Limit miyuchad, wollt gekennt seine Kosagedeitech, als man soll dem Korban Mashlim sein, bei Shabbos habo, war der Chesed die Yom Tov. So I think, okay, unless you tell me otherwise, Shabbos is a unique day. If I missed my opportunity on Shabbos, the next Shabbos is also a unique day. Maybe it gives me the opportunity to catch up. So the Torah has to tell me that doesn't work. Over Yom Batal Korbanah. Whereas when I'm looking at the daily offering, it's like once Rashi tells us that every single day is the special day for that korban tamid, the only thing that distinguishes a Wednesday from a Thursday is that the korban of Wednesday was Wednesday's korban and the korban of Thursday is Thursday's korban. But you can do the same things on a Wednesday and a Thursday. There's nothing in the day that distinguishes them. That's why it's obvious that if the day, which is the only factor that makes this korban special, is gone, the day that was allocated for the Wednesday Tamid offering, now today is Thursday, the only thing that made it Wednesday is that it was a Wednesday Tamid offering, it's bata korbanai. Surely then, you can't bring the korban. Because tomorrow is a Thursday and this was a Wednesday. The korban was for a Wednesday, doesn't belong on a Thursday. Sounds like a great explanation, but the Sabbanit can be a masbik. It's actually not a full explanation. Why not? So what are we arguing? We're arguing over here that I would have thought that because Shabbos has something unique about it, then Shabbos are all linked. Whereas days don't have anything unique about them except for the korban, so you can't then carry the korban over to the next day. However, since just look at how the pasuk introduced all of these korbanos: daily, Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, Yom Tov. Since Sabat zu sagen, as the erste pasuk for Parshas Korbanos, Shabbos when Yisov Hamadim Skorbali Lach Melish Ariach Nichoich Tishmur Lagribli B'Moyadoi. The opening line of the whole conversation about all of the public korbanos, which we're going to speak about, all the way till Shmini Atzeres, starts with the word B'Moyadoi. Is Akdama Klolis to the other korbanos was kum behem shach parsha. Surely that first introductory pasuk sets the tone and speaks to an introductory principle that should apply to all the korbanos. Equally, Tmedim, Usvei Shabbos, V'Rosh Chodesh, Uregolim, V'Seyales Hanach Melishai Gomer, they're all the Abish's so-called bread. The next pasuk starts getting into the details. Let's start with the korban tamid, then from there we're going to go to Shabbos, then to Rosh Chodesh, then we'll get to Yom Tov. For korban tamid, we're going to go into all the details starting with the tamid. But the introductory pasuk applies equally to all the korbanos. If the word b'moyadoi is in the introductory pasuk, then that word b'moyadoi must apply equally to every type of korban. Then the Torah will tell us when all these korbanos, when their moyadoi is. But there's an overarching principle called b'moyadoi. They all have to be brought in their specific time. Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, or Regalim, whatever the times are. Rashi is noch no mevoir. As ich by Tomid is the upper pirish from B'Me'adoi v'baldas b'chol yom Moedat Midim. The only thing that Rashi shows us is it's not only Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh and Yom Tov that have special times. The korban tamid also has a special time. So then that implies that the korbanos that are brought on special days, Shabbos, Yom Tov, Rosh Chodesh, are not in addition to the fact that these are already special days. Now, the Oizgeteltkeit von die Tag is euch zu lieb die Korbanos shel hayom. The Torah is telling us b'moyadoi. Part of what makes this korban unique is that it's allocated to this occasion, Shabbos, this Rosh Chodesh, that Yom Tov. Each day is allocated to the specific korban that belongs to it, in which case, we're back to our original question, which is, why is it that we take it for granted that the korban tamid cannot be brought the next day, but Shabbos, Yom Tov, Rosh Chodesh, you have to tell me from the pasuk what's fundamentally different? The Torah said b'moyad, right across. Once you identify what the moyad is, that's it. You can't carry it across. So Shlomo the Birba is back to my bir and the look at the shyness was me gefind dabei. So to understand that, we're going to see how Rashi uses different language when describing the fact that you may not catch up a korban if he's talking about Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, or Yom Tov. By Shabbos, he gives the most information. Schreibt Rashi an Arichas. Rashi goes into detail. Harei Shaloi, he kriv Shabbos. So if a person hadn't brought the Musaf on the correct Shabbos, Shomeani Yaakov Shtaim Shabbos Haba, he would think that he could bring 2 korbanos Musaf the next Shabbos. Talmud Loima. Therefore, the Torah had to say b'Shabbatoi. You have to bring it on its allocated b'Moyadoi, which means b'Shabbatoi on its allocated Shabbos. Magchimova Yom about the korban, which teaches me that if the day passes, the korban is no longer practical. Mashekin mit etliche psukim weiter, and just a few psukim later, he says it completely differently. By Rosh Chodesh, Dr. Asher Bekitzer, with regards to Rosh Chodesh, he says it briefly. With one little piece of additional information. He says simply, the day is past, the korban doesn't exist anymore. Which means practically you can't catch up. And earlier in Parshas Emor, where the pasuk said each korban has to be brought on its correct day, which is talking about the korbanos of Yom Tov, Rashi says that in the briefest possible way, without adding any information, if the day passes, the korban is no longer available. Why does it say it differently? Es ist Bishlam bar Shchedesh, weil das kommt mit etliche Psukim lachei Perusha b'Shabbatay. Keresh Chodesh makes sense. It's just a few lines after we actually explained the whole principle of Avar Yom Batel Korbanai with regards to Shabbos. Is moving was definitely noch einmal liber chazim barichas harayit shelo Rosh Chodesh zeich v'chulei. He doesn't have to repeat the same things. If you didn't bring it on Rosh Chodesh, I can work that out already from Shabbos. If I didn't bring it on Shabbos, I think I could bring it the next day, but I can't. But when you're talking about the Karbonos of Yontiv, which is long before this, we don't have that information yet. And in fact, it's in a completely different sefer of the Torah. How come there Rashi keeps it so brief? Days pass, the carbon is no longer relevant. Why doesn't Rashi say something along the lines of, if you didn't bring it on the first day Pesach, maybe you bring it on another occasion? So Mefarshim zogen as by regolim daf when it onkum tzalim and shem mevin lo yom tov acher. Mefarshim say that's because it's obvious that you don't. Everybody knows you can't bring a korban from this yom tov on the next yom tov. So Varam says pshita. Azim lo yikriva b'Pesach, shalo yikriva b'Shavuos tashlum in a Pesach. I mean, it's the most logical thing. If you didn't bring a korban Pesach, it wouldn't make any logical sense to now bring it on Shavuos. What's the connection between Shavuos and Pesach? Afal gav the shavim b'korban I say, even though the korbanos are the same, but it's two completely different concepts, two different definitions. This is Pesach and that's Shavuos. How can you catch up Pesach on Shavuos? Whereas Shabbos, every single Shabbos is the same thing as the preceding and the following Shabbos. And every Rosh Chodesh is the same thing as the preceding and following Rosh Chodesh. I think, okay, so therefore Shabbos, I do have the capability to catch up last Shabbos. Kol mashmelon, therefore Rashi has to spell it out for us. Yes, shomeani, that's what you would have thought. You would have thought that Shabbos is all linked and I can catch up my musaf that I missed this Shabbos, next Shabbos, because there's no fundamental difference between one Shabbos and the next. Guess what? The Torah says, oy la Shabbos be Shabbatoi. That does not work. It has to be brought on the correct Shabbos. If not, over yomai, batel korbanai. Olaf izeh. It's the limit var yomai be yomai, when a gel kabbalas haragolim shelo di tashlumim von ein tag yontiv, in dem spätedigen tag tag, in dem selben yontiv gufa. So it's logical that there's no way I could bring a korban musaf of Pesach that I missed on Shavuos and think that Shavuos is somehow going to catch up Pesach. But then the Torah tells me, Dvar Yom B'Yomo, not only that, if I missed a korban musaf on the first day of Pesach, I can't even catch it up on the seventh day of Pesach, for example. B'Zayim Mea Pesach, B'Zayim Mea Sukkos, or Sukkos the same thing. Shaila Zober, V'avosam and Yidafen Ken Limud Hazim Lo Yikif Pesach Zeh Yaakov Shtayim B'Pesach Habo V'Derech Zeh V'Negel L'Shavuos. But the question is, why is nobody telling me that if I didn't bring it this year on Pesach, maybe I should bring it next year? I should have two Karbonos Musaf next year on Pesach, where it will be the same day. So to understand that, and this is where we're going to get to the fundamental principle of what we're trying to understand about this whole concept of Avar Yom Batel Korbanai. Shlomo, the beer and them explanation is in them Geder von Tashlumim Zainen Do Kama Ifan, and there are many facets to consider when you're talking about catching up something that was not done properly. We're going to look at two of them. And we have Mitzadem Gavra, there's the perspective of the person. I had an obligation, I missed the obligation, and I want to catch up my responsibility by bringing the korban tomorrow. The other option is based Mitzad Mechefze, from the perspective of the item. Here's a sheep that was supposed to be used as a korban. So I want to take this sheep that was supposed to be a korban and bring it as a korban, just another time. And just to understand that concept a little bit better, this could be similar to the responsibility that a robber has to return what he stole. If the object he stole is still around, give it back to the person that he stole it from. And that is the simplest way to fulfill what the Torah says, return what was stolen. But if the item is no longer around, he sold it, it broke, it died, whatever, then the chefta is gone. You cannot replace the chefta, but he still has a responsibility to repay the person he stole from, so he's got to give financial reparation. We could have a similar kind of analysis of a korban. The fact that every korban has its assigned time frame is moving us im kim achiv mitzvah von akravas korban yom zeh kemenit mekayim zayin durchem makriv zayin in an andotog. If the requirement was to bring the korban today, that's the geder, that's the definition of this korban, There's no way I can replace it by doing tomorrow. Tomorrow is not today. That's like a person saying, I didn't put on tefillin today, I'll put it on tomorrow twice. It doesn't work. And those is Rashi Madrish Menagel Tmidim, as Machal Yom Hu Moedat Tmidim. So Rashi says that's what you need to know about a korban tamid. Every day is the correct allocated time for that tamid. If you're looking from the perspective of the Cheftzah, that was the Wednesday sheep. There's no value in bringing it on Thursday. But Melahot kein Ort nicht, als die Kimitz Sakravas hat mit dem Yom Zeh, so man kein sein durchbringen nehmen at zweiten Tag, was nicht mehr day. There's no concept, no theories, no logic to say I can fulfill the Wednesday korban by bringing it on a Thursday. It's not its day. So from the Cheftzah perspective, the sheep was allocated as a korban, cannot be used. It was allocated as a Wednesday korban. And you can extrapolate that out to every other korban mentioned in this parasha, which has its allocated time. The Musaf Shabbos, B'Shabbos, the Musaf of Shabbos belongs to that Shabbos, no other day. Rosh Chodesh, that Rosh Chodesh Regalim, that particular Yontiv. Sis nitok in Salka Daitach, as B'Shas mot mafelt makriv sein Musaf Shabbos or mashim sein mitzvah b'chiv diyam zeh b'Shabbos haba k'etz Rosh Chodesh Regalim. It's not logical to say if this was the korban that belonged to that Shabbos that I can somehow now redistribute it to another Shabbos and think that I fulfilled my obligation. Doesn't make sense. Didn't put on tefillin today, tomorrow twice. It's not going to help. The question though is, the fact is this animal exists. The keves hamazum fadim tomid yom zeh, the animal that was going to be used for the korban is still around. Some of them keves makrib zayin mocher. So maybe I don't have the obligation tomorrow per se, and the allocation is not relevant tomorrow, but maybe the animal should be brought tomorrow. But there's a mus v'Shabbos and the same with Shabbos. So makrib zayin b'Shabbos habodik v'osev zayin given ungegret fadim fridik and Shabbos. Maybe we should take the sheep that were prepared for the previous Shabbos and bring them next Shabbos as a musaf. Because this is a tamid sheep. This is a musaf sheep. And even if the specific sheep had not yet been picked, because the funds for that animal were in the coffers of the Beis Hamikdash, designated for this purpose, to buy animals, to bring these korbanos on behalf of the community. Use those funds that were supposed to be for yesterday's Tamid or for this week's Shabbos Musaf and allocate those funds for an extra Tamid tomorrow or an extra Musaf next week. Dos is the Chiddush. Therefore, Rashi has to spell it out for us. If a person did not bring, or if the community did not bring the korban musaf on the right Shabbos, then I would have thought, that's okay, next Shabbos I'll just bring two. In other words, okay, you're right. I don't even think that it's possible for us as a community to discharge a responsibility that belonged to last Shabbos by doing it this Shabbos. We get that. But there's an animal that has to be used as a korban for Shabbos. Put it next Shabbos. There's money that was allocated to fund an animal for a musaf for Shabbos. That money has to be used. Put it to next Shabbos. So if them lernt man up from b'Shabbat, therefore the Torah has to say no. Each animal, each korban belongs to its Shabbos. Magichem of our yoimoy, and this is a whole different understanding of the concept of our yoimoy batel karbonai. Of our yoimoy, if the day passes, batel karbonai, that korban no longer exists. The feasibility, the opportunity for that korban is gone. Says Nitodem Mitzias from them karbana. You think you have to bring this korban next week because he has an animal that is a korban, that is a musaf Shabbos, that wasn't used, so you got to play catch up. No, it's no longer an animal that's a korban musaf. From Friedrich and Shabbos. Not only do we as people no longer have the obligation of this korban because the day has passed, the day has passed, that animal is no longer a korban. And then and the same principle applies to Rosh Chodesh and to Yom Tov. The day passes, the animal is no longer in the category of a korban. There's no value in trying to bring it another day. But that's not so simple when it comes to the korban tamid. Even though, as Rashi points out, every single day is the appropriate day for that particular day's korban tamid. Is netoken kosalka daitach as mizum mekayim zayin dem chivatomid dehayom mitzayin akrav lemocher v'bal as mocher is nit moyadei. So, okay, I cannot fulfill my obligation for Wednesday on a Thursday. So from my perspective, as the the person who is responsible on behalf of the community to bring the Korban Tamid, sorry, I missed it yesterday, nothing we can do. But we don't have any clear evidence from the Torah. We don't have any of that language with regards to the Tamid. So we don't have any evidence to say that this animal allocated as a Korban Tamid is no longer a Korban, just because the day passed. But therefore, according to Pshat, okay, this is not halacha l'maisa, but according to Pshat, you could say, as that animal still carries the allocation of being a Korban Tamid. So I missed Wednesday, but the animal still is a Tamid, should be brought on Thursday. Because the Korban exists either in animal form or in funds allocated for the animal form. But says when pastures as when gelle regalim is in tafel in kosaka daitach azois me oid mes nit makre for pesach yaktiv stam pesach above hetze bezebishvois. Right, and then it goes without saying that I would never think that the same kind of logic applies to a Yom Tov. Warum die Schkolem von jedem Jahr, welche seinen Liebkäufen Karbonen Sibisch Kol Shana V'Shana, seine doch andere Bechol Shana V'Shana, because the funds that are used to bring the Karbonis on Yom Tov, those are funds that are renewed every single year. You have to give the Machatzis HaShekel every single year. Rashi told us clearly that the Machatzis HaShekel is to buy the Karbonis for each particular year, and that's it. It's allocated to that year and not beyond that year. Afilu is nituken svaras was bringing the Karbonis von ein Shana in a Chag von der zweite Shana. So there's no logic to say that you should bring the Karbonis of 1 year, the Yom Tov Karbonis of 1 year, the next year, because it's not allocated b'chlal for that year. Even though the korban maybe is still there as a living creature that is allocated to be a korban, and the reason for that is because the nature of the money that is supposed to run that particular korban belonged to last year and has nothing to do with this year. So I don't even have to spell it out that you can't catch up this Pesach, next Pesach. It's a whole different financial, it's a whole different, fiscal year. So what's Rashi telling us? Something absolutely fascinating, that according to Pshat, there should be an argument that if I miss bringing the Korban Tamid 1 day, we should bring it the next day, not because the obligation still exists, but because the animal had been allocated as a korban, and there's no specific lashon in the Torah that says Dvar Yom B'Yomer like it does by Yom Tov. So what's this got to teach us? From Yena Shal Torah B'Shapir Shashi Zeh, the deeper meaning is Yadua as the Hashos Hashchina Mikdash Al Dezeh B'Chol Olam Kuloi. We know that Beis Hamikdash obviously was a place of intense divine Hashros Hashchina, divine presence, and through that there's kedusha in the whole world. So what caused that Hashros Hashchina is given through the Karbonis, through the Karbonis. Kuzari speaks about this a lot. Okemuven is jeder Zug von Karbonis verbunden mit der anderen Eifen von in der Asher. So it goes without saying that every type of korban, if it's a unique kind of korban, that represents or that facilitates a unique kind of Ashras Hashchina. Depending on what the nature and the definition of that particular korban is, that will design the particular flow of divine presence that it brings about. So we're going to distinguish two kinds of energy based on two groups of korban. Looking at the karbonis in our parasha, you could split them into two groups. Out of Korban Tamid, obviously, the first one we're talking about, which is the Korban Tamid, brought every single day. Then the second category is based on Musaf Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, or Regalim, the special Musaf Karbonis which are brought on special occasions. So these two groups, they speak to two different ways that we could cause the Shekhinah to manifest in this world. The Karbonis from Musaf Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, or Regalim is quite logical that any Musaf that is associated with a special day, that facilitates the kind of divinity that enters the world that changes the nature of the day. Shabbos is a special day, Rosh Chodesh is a special day. So that's what's happening. You're manifesting a godliness that changes the nature of the day. Indeed, Teg is Meir Akdusha, Kedusha Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, Yom Tov, Begolev, Aspel as Man, Zolver, Nazman Kodesh. This particular day, the flow, the energy, the divine revelation that's happening affects the day that it has some uniqueness to it. This is Pesach, it's got a different energy. This is Shavuot, it's got a different energy. And that's what makes it holy, and that's what makes it special, makes it opportune. Aber der Fund, was die Kedusha b'yomim made, macht über dem Zman. But at the same time, the fact that the nature of this Hashasa Kedusha affects that particular period, 24 hours, 7 days, whatever the case is, that implies that it's a Hashasa Shechina with limits. One of the illustrations of the fact that it's limited is, by the end of that day, that Kedusha goes. Whereas, by Korban Tamid, the Korban Tamid is the opposite. Das Ha'inyan was ist da ständig Tamid on Agbolos. The Tamid is there regularly, consistently, constantly, implying there are no limitations. There's no day that the Tamid does not work. Was davon ist verstandig, als der Shasa Kedusha. Shalidei Korban Tamid, that implies that the kind of Kedusha that we bring into the world through the Korban Tamid is verbunden mit des Galles von dem Eibishten allein. That is a revelation not of an element of godliness, but the Eibishter himself, the Eibishter who never changes. Every single day, the same experience is a smear v'sher ständig bli kol agbola, and therefore the hashras hashchina that happens through the Korban Tamid is completely constant and consistent. And das Gufa is a time for was das peilt nit as jeder Tag sos werden a yontif, which, by the way, ironically, is why the day that you bring the Korban Tamid does not transform into a yontif. From bald, as der Hashras Kedusha Shali der Tamid is verbunden mitten Eibishter mit Zadatzmai was an Yavaya Loi Shonisi, because here we're dealing with the kind of Kedusha which relates to the Eibishter himself who never changes. It's nothing get from Zman. Then it's something which is not bound by time. No hechab from Zman. So it's beyond time. So nothing happens to time as a result of introducing this Kedusha because it's way beyond affecting time. So you think, as bleibt Herr von Zman und Peil nicht in Zman. You think, okay, so it's an amazing thing. The Korban Tamid gives us access to this incredibly elevated experience of Kedusha, which is completely beyond time. So maybe that's what happens. It remains beyond time. And therefore, tut of the Pasuk, as doesn't it as I. So the Pasuk says, no. Even though you're introducing such an incredible level of godliness, it seeps down into the reality of this world. Which means, that even the Korban Tamid has an element of time associated with it. Every single day of the Tamid is its unique day to be brought. As B'chol Yom Hu Mo'ed HaTamidim, as Rashi tells us. Every day is the correct time for the Korban Tamid. Even though here we're talking about such a powerful, elevated, extreme version of godliness, which is beyond time, and Loi Shanisi never shifts, never alters, never changes. That does not mean to say that it's divorced from the reality of time and has no impact on this world. Rather, every day is the time for this Tamid, this incredible Gilui. Der Tag, der Zman Gufa, wird anders mit seinem Korban Tamid, nur das setzt sich nicht begilui. Every single day is a different day because a Korban Tamid was brought that day. There's an impact. You're bringing something beyond the world into the world, beyond Hagbala into Hagbala. It's just that we're not capable of seeing it. Kommt euch. As in the meaning from Korban Tamid, wird a chibur von Shnei Afochim. So it turns out that the Korban Tamid is actually a complete paradox. It contains within it absolute opposites. On the one hand, Tamid, was is nicking Gedes man, das wird nimshach in Moedus man kavor. On the one hand, it's Tamid, completely beyond time, and on the other hand, it's Be'moy Adoi, in the reality of time, because that ultimately is the highest form of Kedusha, that it transcends and is within simultaneously. Now, what does that mean for us in personal terms? What that represents for us serving the Eibishter is, we need to get to a point, and when we do, that we serve the Eibishter with absolute consistency. We don't have ups and downs. We're completely consistent. We're as dedicated on a weekday as on a Shabbos, as on a Yom Tov, even as on Yom Kippur. Regardless of our circumstances, regardless of which area of avodah we're focused on, there's one superseding drive, principle, and awareness, which is doing what the Eibishter wants. We said about Korbanos that the Eibishter gets nachas because he said, and we did. How does a person get there? Only with complete, absolute dedication to what the Eibishter wants. This is a person who lives with consciousness of the fact that the Eibishter does not change. So if the Eibishter never changes, I never change in my dedication to the Eibishter because I'm here to serve him. I want to fulfill his rights, and that never changes. I never change. And also, that's what Rashi is illustrating. If we have that consistency in how we serve the Eibishter, then every day becomes a special day, a moed. Every single day is transformed to the extent that every single day is a unique, special, allocated day. There's no such thing as a mundane, ordinary weekday. Every single day is a moed, a time of connection and dedication to Hashem. And therefore fulfills the Eibishter's objective, which was that the Eibishter should be revealed and at home, specifically in the lowest world, which is where we live, which means we don't only achieve holiness on days that are predisposed to holiness because they're special days on the calendar, every single day, including every single weekday, and that hastens the time where Shabbos becomes the nature of every single day. When every ordinary day will be a holy day like Shabbos, the day that is considered, the time period that is considered one long Shabbos forever, which should happen immediately with Mashiach now.